So the historians tell us that it is hard to say with certainty when human beings first became able to calculate with real precision how to predict eclipses of the sun and the moon. The ancient empires of China and Greece, both renowned for the skill of their astronomers and mathematicians, both have respectable claims to the title of having been first to figure out when and how these celestial phenomena would appear in the sky. Whoever it was that came up with it first, the formulas for calculating the timing of eclipses were well in place by the time our predecessors, the rabbis, rose to prominence in the first few centuries of the Common Era. The Talmud is filled with teachings of the ancient sages, among them the precise calculations for how to reckon a Jewish calendar that's organized around the cycles of the sun and the moon. And the math still works. There's a calendar on the shelf of my office that provides the exact dates for every full moon and every Jewish holiday from now until 200 or 300 years into the future. Though the ancient astronomers figured out how to predict when the eclipses were due to take place, there was a marked lack of certainty about what, religiously speaking, an eclipse means. On the one hand, our ancestors viewed eclipses, like every other celestial event, as evidence of God's dominion over the universe. They demonstrate that God, who slides planets around like teacups on a tabletop, is indisputably in charge of the comings and goings of all the heavenly bodies, and for this, God deserves our praise. But the Jewish significance of an eclipse was not just a demonstration that God was in charge of the cosmos. There was also a distinct stream of thought among Jews many centuries ago that eclipses were bad omens, signs of dangerous and malevolent happenings about to unfold. Here's one of my favorite sentences I've ever written. Exactly 2,600 years before John Fogerty wrote the smash single for Creedence Clearwater Revival, the prophet Amos wrote in the Bible about a bad moon on the rise. In that day, he writes, God declares, I will make the sun set at noon. I will darken the earth on a sunny day. I will turn your festivals into mourning and your songs into dirges. And then later on in Jewish textual history, the Talmud declared that eclipses are a sign that God is angry with us. They tell a story about a king who invited guests to his palace for a banquet. But when their misbehavior made the king angry, he told his servants to take away the lamps so the guests would have to sit in the dark. Our ancestors held a certain level of unease when it came to eclipses. And so that made it difficult when the time came for them to come up with an answer to one specific legal question. Do you say a blessing over an eclipse or not? As you know, in Jewish life, we say blessings over all kinds of things all the time. Things we eat, things we do, the seasons of the year. There are plenty of blessings for other natural phenomena too. There's a blessing for seeing a rainbow, a blessing for smelling the first flowers that bloom in the spring, and for seeing the ocean for the first time. But there are no blessings for the destructive forces of nature. There's no blessing for seeing a tornado or a forest fire or landslide. We don't thank God for having sent things into the world that are damaging or violent or painful. We thank God for food, but not for hunger. We thank God for healing, but not disease. We thank God for birth and not death. Because presumably we don't want to tempt God with all of these blessings into sending even more of the things we don't like. So in order to make the determination about whether there ought to be a blessing for a solar eclipse, the rabbis first had to make a decision. Is an eclipse, on balance, more of a good thing or more of a bad thing for the human race? I spent this past weekend in the Hill Country, with a big group of my friends from college. We camped out together in a friend's field in the path of totality so we could watch the eclipse together. Since I've come back, I've heard some of you tell me stories about where you experienced it. I've heard from others who spent Monday watching video clips of it. Just about everybody I talked to had a similar experience. At that moment when the moon crept slowly over the sun, the shadows stretched across the Earth's surface, when eventually the moon slid completely in front of it, the disk of the sun shrank to a thin wedge and then to a tiny bright crescent, and you could stare at the sun with the naked eye and see these wispy flares of its corona. What an unforgettably inspiring moment. Where I was, when the sun disappeared at last, the whole crowd broke into cheers, pumping our fists and yelling like we were at a rock concert or a football game. Everyone there was filled with a shared sense of unity and togetherness. It was exhilarating, it was indescribable, and it lasted barely 4 minutes. What stays with me about that phenomenon and that experience, though, is that unlike a rock concert or a football game, it wasn't a feat of human musicianship or athletic prowess that elicited those feelings. It was just the everyday grace and the mathematical predictability of the solar system doing what it does all the time, whether we notice it or not. There's a story in the New York Times 33 years ago, after the total eclipse of 1991. In that article, the reporter interviewed a Jewish doctor named William Rosenzweig, who was there to witness it. "The universe works," proclaimed Dr. Rosenzweig, a physician from Burlingame, California. "There's some satisfaction in that." Found the good doctor's observation a little bit dry, a little bit clinical, which I guess makes sense since he's a physician and I'm a rabbi. It was a feeling of satisfaction, but the word I'd rather use is awesome. In the truest sense of the word, it was a thing of awe, a thing that filled everyone who watched it with an overwhelming sense of the grandeur of creation. All of those people overcome with joy at the sudden realization that the universe, in all of its baffling complexity, it all works. It was those sensations of majesty and awe that lay behind the rabbi's final legal ruling about whether there ought to be a blessing for an eclipse or not. In the end, they decided, yes, you should say a blessing when you see an eclipse. But the most interesting part of their reasoning was the decision they came to about specifically what the blessing ought to say. Being products of their time and history, they were never able to get completely past the superstition that ruled the day. They couldn't altogether discount the possibility that eclipses were signs of bad things to come. So they wanted to make sure that the blessing they wrote wouldn't sound like it was thanking God for creating eclipses, thanking God for something that might turn out to be a malevolent omen. And yet they knew that they had to come up with a formula that would acknowledge what one feels during a phenomenon like this, the sense of an enormity that dwarfs us and a surprising sense of encounter with a power beyond our own. Here's the wording of the blessing those ancient rabbis came up with. These are the words that I recited when I experienced the moment of totality. You can save these words, by the way, for the year 2044, when you'll have your next chance to experience a total solar eclipse in the United States. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shekocho ugvurato male olam. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, whose strength and glory fills the universe. I think what they came up with was a perfect, elegant solution. It delicately avoids the impression that we're asking for more eclipses in case they really do turn out to be harbingers of misfortune, but it captures and preserves the emotional experience of bearing witness to a generationally significant cosmic event and roots it in the religious experience of belief in a power whose enormity nearly exceeds our comprehension. God's strength and glory fill the universe. And this posture, I'm convinced, is good for us as human beings. We are unique among the animals in our capacity for wonder. We are wired for awe, and to flex that particularly human muscle, whether you call it spirituality or reverence or profound scientific appreciation, that is an act of widening the chambers of the human heart. Even for those who have no need and no interest for those feelings to be expressed in a religious idiom, it is good for us to be awed once in a while. To close, I want to go back to that newspaper article describing the people who gathered to watch the eclipse back in 1991. Here's what the reporter writes. The sky got very dark. The horns of the crescent sun shrank together. The sun disappeared and the leading edge of the moon's shadow swept over them at 1,500 miles an hour. They put away their filters and looked up at a black circle surrounded by a pure white ring of light, the corona formed by the sun's atmosphere. Dr. Rosenzweig was having trouble looking through his viewfinder. I've been crying for 4 minutes, he said. I haven't taken any 35 millimeter pictures because I just forgot about it. I'm absolutely awed. Dr. Rosenzweig stood up and started clapping. Encore, encore, he shouted. And then, upon reflection, author, author. Dr. William Rosenzweig of Burlingame, California, didn't get the opportunity to watch Monday's solar eclipse. He died about 5 years after this interview was taken, when he was moved by tears by the one he watched in Baja in 1991. Before him, of course, came thousands upon thousands of other eclipse viewers, 2.5 millennia worth of scientists, mathematics, astronomers, and philosophers who took ecstatic delight in the celestial acrobatics of planets and moons and stars. All of us, my friends and I who gathered on that hilltop field outside Fredericksburg, everyone else across this continent who witnessed the eclipse, all of us are connected with all of the stargazers who came before us. All of us experiencing a flash of human joy in our brief, finite lives on this majestic, little blue planet. Whether we're people of faith or science or neither, or both, we are blessed, richly blessed, to know the humility and awe that comes from witnessing the handiwork of the author of all, whose strength and glory fill the universe. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shekocho ugvorato malei olam. Author, author. Amen.